Debate has been raging on ways to fight global warming between developing and developed nations for the longest while. We've got the UN climate talks underway this week. What are you expecting? Are we expected to see something more concrete after the failure of the UN Copenhagen summit in 2009?
I think that, we won't really see a legally binding agreement. I think everyone agrees on that there's not going to be a legally binding agreement coming out of Mexico this year. And everyone will be looking to South Africa next year for the next conference to see what kind of agreement comes out of that. What we do expect is some progression on the Copenhagen Accord, which was signed or agreed to last year in Copenhagen. And that's really about limiting the rise in temperature to 2 degrees below industrial levels. It's about financing and accessing financing for developing countries. And so it's really a range of it was a political agreement. And I think that we will see more building blocks on that. So we might see some more information coming out on how the finance is going to be mobilized from developed countries to developing countries. There was talk about 10 billion, 13 billion for by 2012, and then 100 billion going forward to 2020. That's going to be given for developing countries to use to fight climate change.
Well, there's been some insistence at the same time for far tougher targets to be set from here on out, limiting climate change. Is this viable in your books if the lower bars haven't been cleared yet, and where there's this dispute between, as I said, developed and developing nations, and little consensus in terms of what the next steps should be?
Yeah, I think that there's still debate between America and China, and America still hasn't come on board. So China is really pushing America to give in tougher targets, to take on tougher commitments before they commit. And I think, in terms of setting tougher targets, we do need to do that in order to reach the kind of international target to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. But it is a bit of a catch-22 because we haven't been able to do that to date. And unless we get a legally binding agreement, we won't get anywhere near achieving our targets. And some are saying that it's too late anyway. So, I think at this stage it's really about how do we bring America and China on board, and what kind of commitments are they going to take on? Because without them, the international agreement will probably fall flat.
Well, looking at some of the commitments that have been made, we're expected to see some detail of the deal to promote low-carbon economic growth at a fast start. It's called a fast start aid for poor nations, and it's meant to total $30 billion from 2010 to 2021. What are you making of that, and is that the same as the Green Fund that we've been hearing about?
I think the difference is between the Green Fund and this fund. So the 30 billion is part of the Green Fund, and what we'd be looking at here is really the issue is how do we mobilize this funding. So the EU has said that they've got 7 billion available, and that's just a portion of that 30 billion. And how do we start to mobilize that, and how do we access it? And it's going to be a combination of various kind of financing mechanisms. One being probably the Clean Development Mechanism, which South Africa can now participate in the carbon markets through the Clean Development Mechanism. And there's going to maybe be some reforms to that system. And so we'll see some of that funding being accessed via that, and also via potential bonds, green bonds, potential loans. So it'll be a combination of various funds.
At the same time, one would assume we'd have to see some capacity building for developed nations happen at the same time. To what extent should that be more in focus? Is it enough in focus as it should be?
Yeah, I think it's probably not enough in focus as it should be. There does need to be more focus on it. There has been, ad hoc kind of not really integrated education and awareness going on in developing countries, and we need to see maybe more of a push from the United Nations for that, because that is key to helping us not only reduce our carbon emissions, but also to really look at adaptation. So now what happens to Africa? Africa is, obviously we've got other issues like poverty alleviation, community upliftment, development, and how do we now start to adapt to the impacts of climate change? Because we will be one of the countries and one of the nations that's worst hit by climate change.
Of course, looking at rising damage from floods, droughts, heat waves, rising sea levels as well, just to mention a few. Let's take a look at carbon trading specifically, because this is one area where we should have been benefiting from, and we haven't exactly. We've been going through commentary where South Africa and African industries have been slow in actually taking advantage of the Kyoto Protocol's potential economic and environmental benefits, particularly the clean mechanism development that's been mentioned. What's your view on that?
Yeah, I mean, we as Deloitte really feel that there's a number of reasons why we haven't managed to access the financing available through the Kyoto Protocol, the Clean Development Mechanism, which basically allows developing countries like South Africa to implement emission reduction projects and then get carbon credits and sell those to developed countries who have targets. And really the reasons why we haven't managed to access these is, I think, firstly, a lack of awareness, a lack of education. Exactly as you were saying a bit earlier, there hasn't been that drive towards education in developing countries. And then also, again, it's really a difference of priorities. So South Africa's got to deal with AIDS, with poverty alleviation, with community upliftment, and these mechanisms that have been created, these European mechanisms, don't seem to suit or don't seem to be able to reduce greenhouse gas emissions at the same time as uplifting communities. It just doesn't suit those type of projects, and that's a huge issue for Africa.
Raising the question then, should we be seeing some reform and expansion of carbon market mechanisms?
We should, and the discussions on that will start on Thursday in Cancun about how we reform these systems. China's managed to take advantage of them, but Africa is lagging behind. I think out of about 2,500 registered projects, Africa has 40. And so we are lagging behind, and I think there's been a kind of a focus now by the United Nations on, okay, how do we incentivize, how do we motivate African countries to now start accessing this financing that's available? And then what do we need to do that? And so it will be reformed. The system is full of rules and regulations which make it difficult for African countries to access. It doesn't suit the type of projects. We're still developing, and we need to develop along a low carbon pathway, but it's not really helping us to do that. So they're looking at reforming it to see how it will help us to do that.
What should countries themselves on the continent be doing to leverage more economic benefit from this?
I think awareness is the first step. So I think to understand the systems, understand what's available, understand what you can access for various projects. So it's really about building the business case for it. So, we're starting to see that happen in South Africa at the moment. So we've got obviously the Clean Development Mechanism, but there's also other grants and incentives from government. There's also, now there's a potential carbon tax that's going to be introduced. National Treasury is saying we're going to increase the price of fossil fuels by 2012, in fact. And so companies really need to start looking into these issues because the business case is starting to build, and we will see companies taking more and more advantage of this.
Part of all of that, we've had a national climate change policy being drafted by the Department of Environmental Affairs. That was done last week, and the focus within that on alignment as we progress towards 2012. Run us through that and how you're reading those kind of steps that South Africa particularly is making right now.
Yeah, I think the national climate change policy really makes some kind of aggressive commitments. Already we have these targets of 34% below business as usual by 2020, and I mean that's a really significant target for South Africa. And this climate change policy really reiterates that, reinforces it, and kind of sets really aggressive initiatives like mandatory energy efficiency for businesses, integration of climate change into every policy that exists. And so there are a lot of government is really starting to focus on climate change and focus on how as South Africa do we get it right. But it's going to be interesting, I think, to see how that's actually implemented, because a lot of these, a lot of it might be all talk. So how do we get to the point where we can implement mandatory energy efficiency targets? How do we get to the point where we have a carbon tax which doesn't cripple business but incentivizes the shift towards a low carbon economy? So how do we kind of meet halfway? And it's important really to start having those discussions now.
Well, at least the questions being raised and the steps being taken. A long walk ahead, we know, though.